The night she came over, I had candles burning on the back porch. Not because I planned it that way. I'd been sitting out there most of the evening reading, watching the fireflies come up from the grass along the fence line. My neighbor's dog had been barking on and off since sundown. The candles were just there, the way things are when you've lived alone long enough to make small rituals out of ordinary hours. When I heard the knock at the front door, I almost didn't answer it. I knew who it was. My name is Edmund. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial contracting company from a beat-up truck, a used nail gun, and a handshake agreement with a lumberyard in Columbus, Ohio that let me run a tab when things were thin. I poured concrete foundations in February. I climbed scaffolding in July heat that would buckle your knees. I missed dinners and holidays and 2 of my son's Little League championships because I was somewhere in central Ohio trying to keep a job site on schedule. My former business partner, a man named Craig, used to say I was the engine and he was the steering wheel. He meant it as a compliment. For a long time, I believed him. Craig and I met at a trade show in Cincinnati. I was 41. He was 38, well-dressed in the way contractors rarely are, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to beg a bank for a line of credit. He had connections I didn't. Developers, city planners, a cousin who sat on a commercial zoning board in Franklin County. I had the crews, the reputation, the 15 years of finished jobs that nobody had ever had to call me back on. We shook hands in a hotel lobby. By the following spring, Mercer and Hale Construction was incorporated. I was Hale. The first few years were good, better than good. We landed a school renovation contract, then a municipal parking structure, then a mixed-use development downtown that got written up in a regional business journal. I was proud of what we'd built. I used to drive past some of those buildings just to look at them, not in a vain way, more the way you look at something and feel that it was worth the cost. Then Craig started talking about repositioning. That was his word, repositioning. He said the real money wasn't in construction anymore, it was in development. In owning the buildings, not just building them. He wanted us to pivot, bring in investors, take on debt to acquire properties. I was cautious. I'd been cautious my whole career, and that caution is why we hadn't gone under in 2008, when half the contractors I knew folded. I told him I needed time to think it through. He told me I didn't have vision. He didn't say it meanly. He said it the way you tell someone they have a blind spot, almost kindly, like he was doing me a favor by pointing it out. He said I was a builder, not a businessman, that I was too attached to the operational side to see the strategic picture. I let it go. I shouldn't have. The buyout happened on a Tuesday in March, about 8 years ago now. I came into the office to find Craig sitting across from our attorney, a man I'd never met, who turned out to be Craig's personal attorney, not our firm's, and a document on the table that proposed to restructure my equity stake in the company. Craig had spent the better part of 14 months moving contracts, client relationships, and vendor agreements into a subsidiary entity he'd created without my knowledge. Technically, he said, everything was within the bounds of his operational authority as managing partner. Our original agreement had language about strategic direction that his attorney had apparently spent considerable time with. I sat there and read every page. When I looked up, Craig said, "You're a craftsman, Edmund. You'll always be a craftsman. But this company needs to grow in a direction you're not built for." I said, "I built this company." He said, "And you'll be compensated fairly for that." The number on the table was not fair. I took it anyway. Not because I was afraid, and not because I was afraid, and not because I didn't have a case. My attorney, my actual attorney, the one I called that afternoon, told me I had grounds to contest the restructuring and possibly pursue damages. But litigation would take years. I was 61. My wife, Diane, had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 2 months prior. I did not have years to spend in depositions. I did not have the energy to fight a war on 2 fronts. I signed the papers. Craig walked me to my truck. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll land on your feet, Edmund. Men like you always do." I drove home. I didn't tell Diane right away. I sat in the driveway for a while first. What followed was the kind of 18 months you don't talk about much, even with people who love you. I took some subcontracting work, smaller jobs, the kind I hadn't done personally in 15 years. My knees weren't happy about it. My pride wasn't either, but pride is a luxury, and I couldn't afford luxuries just then. Diane's care had costs that insurance covered partially and incompletely. We made adjustments. We sold the lake house we'd had since the kids were small. I told her it was time anyway, that we weren't getting up there enough to justify it. She knew I was lying, but she didn't push. That's the kind of woman she is. She knows when to let something alone. My son Marcus offered to help financially. I told him no, and I meant it. He had a young family of his own. That wasn't his weight to carry. What I had in those months was time. More time than I'd had in 30 years. And what I did with that time, what I did quietly, without telling anyone, without any announcement, was think. I had contacts. Craig had never met, old relationships from before the partnership. Guys I'd poured concrete with and poured coffee with for decades. One of them, a developer named Pete Ashworth out of Westerville, called me about 8 months after the buyout. He'd heard I was available. He had a project, a 40-unit workforce, housing development, city-backed, union labor preferred. We had a coffee. We had several coffees. By late fall, I had incorporated a new entity. Just my name on the paperwork. No partners. A small line of credit from a community bank in Dublin whose loan officer had known me since the 90s. I hired 4 guys I trusted from the old days, 2 of them who'd worked for me at Mercer and Hale, and left when Craig changed the culture after I was gone. We started small. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because I was secretive by nature, but because I'd learned something from the years with Craig. Talk costs you. Every time you tell someone what you're going to do, you give them an opportunity to tell you why you can't. I didn't need anyone's opinion of what I was capable of. I needed footings poured before the ground froze. Mercer and Hale, in the meantime, had its difficulties. Craig's repositioning strategy had involved taking on significant debt to acquire 2 commercial properties in a part of Columbus that got rezoned in ways that hurt the development projections. I heard about this through the usual channels. The industry is smaller than it looks, and people talk. There was also an issue with a city contract, a dispute about cost overruns on a municipal project that got some coverage in the Columbus Dispatch. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that. When you're 62 and you've spent your life in this business, you know how fast things can turn. You know the difference between a competitor's stumble and your own stability. I kept my head down and kept building. The message from Craig came on a Thursday evening, about 2 years after I'd signed those papers. He was polite. He said he'd heard I was active again, that he'd seen my company's name on a permit filing for a project near Gahanna. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said, and I remember this distinctly, that he'd always respected my work ethic, and that he thought, given where things stood, there might be room for a conversation about collaboration. I read it twice. I wrote back, "I appreciate you reaching out. I'm not in a position to take on partners at this time. Best of luck with your projects." He wrote back once more. I didn't respond. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Pete, who told me Craig had reached out to him as well, apparently looking for introductions back into the city contract pipeline. Pete had declined. I appreciated that. I didn't ask him to. The project near Gahanna finished 8 months later, on time and 4% under budget. Then another project. Then a school addition in Hilliard. Then a small commercial renovation in Bexley that brought in 2 referrals I hadn't anticipated. I hired 2 more people, then 3. Diane came to the ribbon cutting on the Hilliard School. She stood next to me in the parking lot in November wind and held my arm and didn't say much. She didn't need to. Some moments don't require narration. By last spring, Hale Construction, just Hale, my name alone, had finished or contracted 11 projects. The revenue wasn't what Mercer and Hale had been at its peak, but it was solid, it was clean, and every dollar of it belonged entirely to what I had built, with my own hands and my own name, without anyone's steering wheel. The house is something I should explain. Diane and I had lived in the same split level in Upper Arlington for 26 years. We raised our kids there. It was a good house. Practical, the kind of house that holds a family without calling attention to itself. When we sold the lake property, I told myself the split level was fine, and it was. But Diane had always wanted a single story. Not for any dramatic reason, just because the stairs had started to feel like a negotiation with the Parkinsons. When the Hilliard School project came in under budget, I used my portion to buy a lot in a quiet development east of Worthington. I designed the house myself, the way a contractor would, practically without showmanship, but with the kind of detail that comes from knowing what things cost and why they matter. Wide doorways, no thresholds. A bathroom layout that a wheelchair can navigate, though we haven't needed that yet, and I pray we won't for some time. A back porch that faces west, where you can sit in the evening and watch the light change across the tree line. I didn't tell people, not even the kids, at first. I wanted to be sure it would happen before I made it a story. We moved in last October. Diane cried a little. I pretended not to notice so she could have that privately. Then I went out back and sat on the porch and watched the evening come in and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Craig heard about the house through someone we both knew. I don't know exactly who. The circles in this industry overlap in ways you stop trying to track after a while. He sent another message, this one more casual than the last. He said he'd heard I'd built something special. He said he was in the area sometimes and would love to stop by if I was ever open to it. He said, and this is the part I've thought about. No agenda, Edmund, just catching up. I sat with that message for a week. My son, when I mentioned it, said, "Tell him no." He said it without hesitation, the way young people can afford to be clear about things. My daughter, who is a more patient person than her brother, said, "What do you want, Dad?" That was the right question. What I wanted, I realized, was not what Craig probably assumed I wanted. I didn't want to show him the house. I didn't need to see his face when he walked through the door. I am 63 years old. I have been in this industry long enough to know that most of what people call revenge is just ego wearing a different coat. What I wanted was to answer the question I'd been carrying since that Tuesday morning 8 years ago. The question wasn't about Craig. It was about me, about whether I was, as he had said with such easy confidence, only a craftsman, whether the thing I was built for was smaller than I'd believed. I had already answered that question. I'd answered it in the permits and the footings and the finished projects and the payroll I'd made every 2 weeks for people who depended on me. But there's answering a question privately, and there's letting the person who asked it see that you've answered it. I wrote back, "Sure, come by Saturday around 4. He arrived in a car that was nicer than I expected, given what I'd heard about Mercer and Hale's last 2 years. People find ways to maintain appearances. I know that better than most. I met him at the front door. He stopped on the front step and looked at the house the way people do when they're trying to calibrate, taking in the roofline, the windows, the detail work on the porch columns that one of my Finnish carpenters had spent 3 days getting right. I know that look. It's the look of a person in the building industry who is quietly doing math. I said, "Come on in." He came in. He walked through slowly. He asked questions. Good ones, the kind only someone who knows construction would ask. How did I handle the drainage on the east side? What was the foundation detail? Who did the trim work? I answered each one the way I would answer any colleague. without drama, without pointed pauses. We ended up on the back porch. The fireflies were just starting. The candles were burning. I'd made coffee, and I poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the table the way I'd sat across 1,000 job site tables over the years. He looked out at the yard for a while. Then he said, "You built this yourself?" I said, "I did." He said, "I heard you got a good pipeline going again." I said, "It's going well." He said, "I'm glad." And I think he meant it, the way people mean things that are also inconvenient for them to mean. Then he said, and I'd wondered if he would, and I'd prepared myself for the discomfort of it, "I probably didn't handle things well. Back then, with the buyout." I looked at him. He said, "I thought I knew what the company needed. I still think the strategy was sound in principle, but the way I went about it." He stopped. Looked at his coffee. "I didn't give you what you'd earned." I let that sit there for a moment. What I felt was not what I expected to feel. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have imagined feeling back in that driveway 8 years ago when I sat alone trying to figure out how to tell my wife. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to tired and to done. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." He asked about Diane. I told him about the Parkinsons, briefly, without detail. He said he was sorry, and his face said he meant it. We sat on that porch until the light was almost gone. We talked about the industry, about the rezoning situation in Franklinton, about a common acquaintance who'd retired to Hilton Head. The conversation found its own footing, the way conversations do when the weight comes out of them. When he stood to leave, he extended his hand. I shook it. At the door, he turned and looked back at the house one more time. He said, "You always knew what something was worth, Edmund. I should have understood that better." I said, "Drive safe, Craig." I closed the door. I went back out to the porch, poured the last of the coffee, sat down and watched the fireflies doing their slow, irregular work above the grass. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler kicked on. The neighbor's dog, the one that barks all evening, was quiet for once. I thought about what Craig had said, about being a craftsman. I've turned it over 100 times in the years since that Tuesday morning. The way he said it, like it was a limitation, like being someone who builds things with precision and care, and shows up when he says he'll show up, is somehow the lesser version of what a man could be. I think about the school in Hilliard, the kids who eat lunch in the cafeteria I built, the families in the Gahani units who have somewhere decent to live because somebody poured that foundation right. I think about Diane in her room with a wide doorway and the no-threshold bathroom, moving through the house without negotiating it. Craig was wrong about what craftsmen are built for. We're not built for less. We're built to make things that last after the meeting is over and the strategy deck has been revised and the repositioning has run its course. We build things people live inside of. We build things that hold. I sat there until the coffee was gone and the yard was fully dark, and the candles had burned themselves down to the holders. Then I went inside, locked the door, and went to check on Diane. She was asleep in the chair in her room, a book open on her lap. I took the book carefully, set it on the table, turned off the lamp. Then I went to bed in the house I built. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what Craig said that morning. Not the legal language in the documents, not the number on the table. The other thing, the casual, almost kind way he told me I was only a craftsman, like it was a fact about me, the way your height is a fact, like it explained everything and excused everything at the same time. For a while it did something to me that I'm not proud of. Not anger exactly, more like doubt. The quiet, middle-of-the-night kind that doesn't announce itself. You lie there and you wonder if maybe the person who took something from you understood something about you that you didn't. That's the real damage people like Craig do, not the money. The money I could rebuild, and I did. It's the story they tell about you, and the moment you start telling it to yourself. What I know now, at 63, is this. The way a person treats what you've built says everything about their own relationship with building. Craig had never poured a foundation in February. He had never driven to a job site at 5 in the morning because a crew chief called in sick and the concrete truck was already on its way. He had never sat with a family and explained why their timeline slipped and what he was personally going to do to get it back on track. He moved things around on paper and called it strategy. There's nothing wrong with that. The world needs people who can see the larger picture. But he made the mistake of thinking that because he couldn't do what I did, it must be worth less. That's a confusion a lot of people carry. They mistake visibility for value. They mistake loudness for leadership. Craig was good at both. I was good at neither. And for a long time, I let that feel like a deficit. What changed me wasn't the new company, or the Hilliard School, or even the house. What changed me was watching Diane move through those wide doorways I designed for her. That's what I understood. Not abstractly, but in my body, the way you understand something when it costs you, that what I build matters because of what it holds. The people inside it. The life inside it. The life inside it. No repositioning strategy produces that. No acquisition model accounts for it. Craig came to my house and saw something he hadn't planned for. Not my success. I don't think that's what stopped him on the front step. I think he saw craft. He saw 31 years of knowing exactly what something is worth and building it to that standard without cutting a corner or inflating a number or moving a decimal to make a deal work. He saw what happens when a man spends his whole life doing the one thing he was made to do and does it honestly and doesn't stop. He apologized that evening. I accepted it, and I meant that acceptance. But I want to be clear. I didn't need it. I needed it once. I needed it that afternoon in the driveway when I couldn't figure out how to go inside and face my wife. But by the time he said it, sitting on my porch with his coffee, I had already answered the question for myself. In concrete and timber and finished trim and a bathroom layout that lets Diane move through her own home with dignity. That's what I'd tell anyone who's been told they're only built for one thing, and that one thing isn't enough. The person saying it is describing their own limits, not yours. You don't have to argue with them. You don't have to prove them wrong out loud. You just have to go build the next thing and the next. And keep showing up until what you've made speaks for itself. Not to them, but to the people who actually live inside it. That's the only answer worth giving.